Okay, hello everyone. So for today we're going to be focusing on biology. And compared to what we were doing last time with mitosis and meiosis and the transport process in biology, we're going to this time just look at what is the role of organization in biology. So that's another kind of principle in biology that will help you understand how life itself works in general, right? Um, so after we look at organization, we're then going to look at some examples of organization in nature. Particularly, we're going to start with the example of humans first, and then we'll move on to plants, for example, right? It's a bit tough to see organizations in other organisms, like Protoctus, because those are unicellular. So we're only going to be discussing about the cases where we have multicellular organisms instead. All right, but just to start, okay, so with organization, we are talking about how different cells work together to do different functions. Okay, or I suppose in this case it would be a group of cells working together to perform the same function and so on, right? Firstly, remember that if you have a bunch of organelles working together, then you would call that a cell. Right, so a cell is a kind of compartmentalized unit that has many of these organelles that are working together, right? So the typical definition of a cell is that it is a single functional unit of life. And from a cell, we can move upwards towards what a tissue is, right? Now, a tissue, most people define it as a group of cells working together to perform a particular function. But the actual definition, you've got to be a bit careful about that because it's not necessarily that the cells are similar to each other. It's not always the case that they're similar. It could also just mostly be the case that there's many differences between them, but they're just having the same genes, for example, right? Or the same or similar activated genes, I suppose, right? But for tissues, one way to define it that I like is that you can say that it is a collective aggregate. So a collective aggregate of cells working together to perform or to achieve a similar function, right? So the key point is that they all have a goal in mind, okay? And just be mindful, anything that we're looking at right now from this point onwards comes under multicellular organisms. So we're talking about organisms that are made up of more than one cell. And that would include animals, plants, fungi. Okay, then after we have a tissue, if you've got a group of tissues working together, then we call that an organ. So, for instance, let me just give you an example of this. An example of a tissue, oh, sorry, an example of a cell could just be an animal cell. An example of a tissue could be the endothelial lining of the blood vessels, for example. For an organ, an example of an organ could be the heart, right? So this is just a group of tissues working together to achieve a similar function. And as we move on from an organ, we then have many organs together would be called an organ system if those organs are working together to perform a particular task, right? So again, the same definition as before. So it's a group of organs working together to achieve a similar kind of function. And then after an organ system, we then have the entire organism itself. Okay, so a group of organ systems working together to perpetuate the life of that person would be called an organism. Okay, so that is what basically makes up an organism. But I suppose in this case, you really should be talking about a multicellular organism, not a unicellular one, because the definition doesn't work for a unicellular one. Okay, and if you have a bunch of organisms together, you would call that the population. You have a bunch of populations of different organisms together, you'd call it a community. If you have many communities in one area, I suppose, then you could call it an ecosystem. And many ecosystems throughout the planet, I suppose you could first call it a biome, which has the ecosystem, and then the biosphere. Okay, but we will look into these definitions later on. Also, just be mindful that it goes backwards as well. For example, organelles are made up of chemical processes, and then chemical processes are made up of chemicals, which is made up of molecules, which is made up of atoms, and it keeps on going down and down and down, right? So this has a big link towards physics and chemistry as well. But anyways, what we're going to look at is we're just going to focus on organ systems in nature. And like I said, we are going to look at organ systems in humans first. And then we are going to look at some organ systems in plants as well. So the classic organ system to start with is the human digestive system. So that's what we're going to look at. Just so you can see a case study of an example of how organ systems actually work in reality, right? So we're again just going to be looking at the digestive system. Okay. And this is quite a lengthy process because there's quite a bit to talk about. It's also very interesting, I would say, because you then, after learning about the digestive system, you understand what digestion is about, right? Now, before I even start with diagrams and whatnot, I just need to give you an overview of about the five main, I suppose, sub processes of digestion, okay, or of the system. So, the first process is a process that's called ingestion. Ingestion is just the intake of food, right? So when you swallow food or when you're chewing the food, that is ingestion essentially. So it's when you're intaking the food. The second process in that is actually digestion, right? So digestion in biology is defined as the chemical breakdown. You can also call it mechanical, I suppose, but it's chemical breakdown of large, complex molecules of food into simpler, absorbable forms. Okay, so that is what digestion is. And then after digestion, we then have the next process, which is absorption. And absorption is the actual intake of those molecules into the bloodstream. So it is referring to the absorption of the digested food into the insides of the organism. And then we finally have assimilation. Okay, assimilation is literally alluding to that saying, which is you are what you eat. So based on the food that you eat, you literally are incorporating that food into your own being, right? So that is not to say that's not to say that if you if you eat a particular, like, let's say that you eat an animal like a deer, that doesn't mean you're going to behave more like a deer. It's more to do with the biochemical aspect of it. Of course, there are some things that you can eat that are based on the chemicals of that thing that can influence your psychology and your mood. That is something that is a fact, right? For example, if you eat something that has a particular amount of hormones and those hormones are actually what's the word? If those hormones actually work for humans, then those hormones can actually influence how you will behave. That is something that can happen. But it is not so literally to the fact of like, oh, you're gonna behave exactly like this animal. No, it's more so that if it does have something that's not thoroughly cooked, I suppose, then it could maybe influence how you're gonna behave. But otherwise, it will just influence your physiology and maybe very slightly your psychology, right? So if you're eating something with a lot of protein, that will help you build muscles, for example. And then carbohydrates will just give you energy. But we will talk more about that later on, right? So, anyways, within assimilation, you should know that assimilation is just that incorporation of those chemicals into bodily processes. So it's the incorporation of the chemicals into the body processes. Right? And then finally, last step here is egestion. Egestion is the removal of the undigested food from the body. So smaller organisms do this, and so do we. Okay. Just one thing, just to emphasize, there is a difference between urination, which comes under excretion, and egestion, which comes under defecation, essentially, right? So defecation is referring to the removal of the feces. So when you're using number two, that's what egestion is. Number one is not actually egestion. That is something else, right? So that's something that's called excretion, which I'll just talk about very briefly because we're on that topic right now, right? So egestion is the removal of undigested food. That's the biological definition of it. Excretion is not the same. So excretion is referring to urine, right? That is not the same as egestion. Excretion is defined as the removal of nitrogenous waste from the body. So as we're talking about this, we're not going to be talking about excretion because excretion is to do with another organ system entirely. The digestive system is something to do with these five steps. It's not to do with excretion. So excretion is when you've got something like a protein. If you've got excess proteins in the body and you break down those proteins, then some of those proteins will be turned into ammonia, which the body will then convert into urea, which is like a less toxic version of it. But that urea needs to be removed from the body because it's toxic. So what will happen is the excretory system of the body, which is the kidneys, will remove that urea in the form of urine. But it's not just the kidneys that does that, it's also the sweat glands. When you are sweating, there's actually a very slight amount of urea that is released from the body, which is why sweat actually has an odor. We've been adapted, we've been evolved to, smell that this urea smells bad, because obviously the organisms that don't smell that it's bad will not survive, but the organisms that do smell that it's bad are likelier to survive and reproduce over time. Like that's how the whole process works, right? But anyways, okay. So the five steps of the digestive system are the following, and we're going to be investigating how these five steps happen, right? So ingestion takes place solely at the mouth. Digestion takes place basically in every part we're going to talk about. It takes place within the mouth, the stomach, and the intestines. Absorption takes place in the small intestines. I should clarify that this doesn't take place. The digestion doesn't take place in the large intestines. It also and absorption also takes place in the large intestines as well. Assimilation takes place within the actual blood or the body, and then egestion takes place from the rectum or the anus. Okay, so that's or I guess the large intestines also like evolved in egestion, but we will get to that as well. Okay, so anyways, these are the five processes, and from this, there's just one more keyword I want you to just recall, I suppose, before we begin, and that is just what an enzyme is, and then some of the food groups as well, right? So, firstly, it'll become more apparent why I'm explaining these, but an enzyme is a biological catalyst. What that basically means is that it's a molecule that is made by an organism in a natural setting to be able to speed up a chemical reaction. So it speeds up reactions without getting used up. So without getting used up. Okay, so these are used all over the place in digestion, and you're going to see examples of these later on. And before we move on, I want to talk about the three groups the three groups of food that we're going to talk about. I just want you to know about them really briefly. We've got a group that's called carbohydrates. We've got a group that's called protein, and we've also got a group that's called lipids. Okay, now carbohydrates are referring to the sugars in food. So things like starch in potato crisps, things like the glycogen that our body stores, and then the simpler versions of these when you break them down. So you've got glucose, you've got fructose and sucrose and so on. These are the sugar groups. So we call them energy giving, right? These guys give energy to the body, right? Now, protein, these are called the bodybuilding foods because these are made up of something that's called amino acids. The amino acids that can join together to make peptides, and many of these peptides that are joined together will make a protein, right? And these come under bodybuilding foods. So, meaning if you get a bunch of proteins, you can use them to structurally build up your body. And this is why bodybuilders, for example, are essentially obsessed over how much protein intake they're taking, right? Because a very effective bodybuilder would know that in order to actually build muscle, there are two components required. The first is the protein, and the second is the stimulation towards the growth hormones, which is what exercise actually does, right? So that is essentially what I would say are the two key things, right? And of course, having the proper rest period after muscle dystrophy and so on. But anyways, after that, we then move on to lipids, and lipids are a fancy word for fats or triglycerides. Both essentially mean the same thing. One is a posh way of saying it, and one is a simpler way of saying it. Okay, fats are a bit different to protein and carbohydrates because carbohydrates and proteins have a really long, complicated buildup. I suppose these are actually polymers. Polymers means that they're made up of many molecules that are many of the same units are joined up together to make like a longer molecule. That's what carbohydrates and proteins are. But lipids aren't actually polymers. They're just made up of like four molecules that are joined together, which is fatty acids and glycerols. So triglycerides are actually made up of something that's called a glycerol with three fatty acids. Now, these guys over here, lipids are not that dense as an energy store, but they can be burnt quickly to give a lot of energy, right? So lipids are still used in the energy process, but they can be burnt quicker and they're not as densely stored as carbohydrates. Typically speaking, once we have an excess amount of carbohydrates stored in the body, then the body will turn to make any of those carbohydrates turn into fat stores in the adipose layer of the body instead, right? So the adipose layer is the fat layer of the body. So generally when you've got the skin, right, underneath the skin you've got the fat layer, and I believe underneath that fat layer you've got the muscles, and then so on. Okay, but that's what's happening with lipids over here. They also have uses in other areas. For example, they're also used to transport particular types of hormones across the body. We will cover what hormones are later on. Hormones are like chemical messengers, but you'll learn more about what they mean later on. Okay, well, I just want you to know what these terms are so that when I'm drawing the diagrams for the digestive system, it's all going to make sense to you. Okay, now what we're going to do is we're going to look at the digestive system from the perspective of food, right? So we're going to start with the mouth first. This is where the food goes in. We're going to talk about what happens in the mouth, and we're going to talk about each process of once the food goes lower down into the body, what actually happens. Okay, right. So let's start with the mouth first. I'm going to have like a really crude diagram of what's happening. So in the mouth, let me just draw this in the center, which we've got over here. We have a couple of things going on. Firstly, you've got your teeth. This is so sorry we don't teeth, but you just gotta imagine that they're good. So the teeth, as well as the tongue, assist in something that is called mechanical grinding, right? So the first obvious thing that happens in the mouth of the person, right? So if I just draw here, that is the mouth. The teeth and the tongue, they assist in mechanical grinding of the food. And remember, the reason why we want to be mechanically grinding the food is because we want to be increasing the surface area. And the reason why we want to increase the surface area is to do things like increase the diffusion rate later on, or increase the rate of active transport later on, or also to increase the rate of enzyme action, because this will make it easier for the enzymes to break down the substances in the mouth. Okay, so it's easier for the enzyme action. Right? So that's what's happening in the mouth. Another really important thing that happens is that there are two glands in the mouth, exocrine glands, because they excrete substances outside of the body, right? Because the mouth is technically outside of the body, it's not inside the body. I mean, like colloquially, you'd say it's inside of the body, but it's an open cavity, so that still counts as the outside of the body. Okay, but anyways, right? Um, what these two salivary glands do is they actually secrete a substance that's called salivary amylase. This is the first enzyme that you are learning about now. Now, amylase, a very nice cheat code about these substances, is that they actually are named after what they act on. So salivary means it is in the saliva, and amylase means it's an enzyme that acts on amylose. Amylose is a type of glucose, or sorry, a type of carbohydrate, which we call polysaccharide because it's a very big carbohydrate. But it's a type of carbohydrate that's found in starch. So what amylase does is it breaks down the amylose into simpler maltose, right? Maltose is a double sugar, so we call it a disaccharide. So it's not fully broken down just yet, but it will be broken down soon enough. Okay, so amylose, this is breaking down, or amylase is breaking down the amylose in starch into maltose. Okay, so that's the only chemical action that happens in the mouth. Nothing happens to the protein just yet. Now, this food is also mixed with saliva, which contains water to dissolve anything to make it easier for the body to activate later on. And it will then lead into these two pipes the frontwards pipe will be covered by this flap of muscle which we call the epiglottis. The epiglottis will cover the trachea, which is the windpipe. Okay, so this windpipe over here is covered by the epiglottis to make sure that we don't choke on the food. And then behind that, we have the actual food pipe. Okay, now this food pipe over here is going to lead into the stomach, which I'm just going to draw like this. Okay, so that's just a typical kind of stomach, for instance. Now, a couple of things about the stomach. Before the food even goes into the stomach, there is actually a gateway right here. You can think of this as a sphincter or as a valve. We actually call this the cardiac sphincter. If you ever get something that's called a heartburn is when you eat too many oily foods, for example, and that can cause the sphincter to improperly close. That will cause some of the acid that's in the stomach to actually escape the food pipe and then cause a burning sensation because the acid is literally corroding the food pipe, right? So in the stomach, once you pass the cardiac sphincter, there's a couple of details that are pretty important. The first detail is the mechanical aspect of it, which is again, the stomach has these slight bumps over here, which are kind of like projections. These bumps over here, what they actually do is they help turn the food, right? So these mechanically churn the food. The other thing as well is that they also secrete a layer of mucus, protective mucus. Okay? And apart from that, there's also some cells that will produce acid inside the stomach. Okay? This acid is actually made from HCl, it's hydrochloric acid, which you will learn more about in chemistry once you understand how acids work. But for the time being, just think of acids as a substance that's very reactive, I suppose. Okay, so just think of it like that, right? But the purpose of this acid is twofold. The first purpose is that it makes the enzymes act at a comfortable pH level. This is a comfortable acid level, I suppose, right? If the enzymes are acting at this level, then they perform more optimally. And the second function is that the acids will kill any microorganisms that are in the food. Okay, that's not to say that you should eat food that's raw. Okay, well, what this does is that it actually will be minimizing, hopefully, the harm of any kind of contaminated food. That's the hope, right? Of course, you should always try to eat food that's cooked because that will make sure that the microorganisms are killed, so that you will not get infected by them. Right, but that's what this acid over here does. It kills microorganisms, or it hopefully kills all the microorganisms, and then it will also make the enzymes act at an optimal temperature. Now, the other point as well that happens here is that there are some more enzymes that are released in the stomach over here. The first enzyme is actually called pepsin. Pepsin is what we call a peptidase. It's actually called an exopeptidase, sorry, an endopeptidase, meaning that it works from inside the peptide. It breaks the peptides from the inside. So what this basically does is it breaks down the proteins into peptides. There's another pepsin as well that's called, like there's another enzyme as well that's called renin, but you've got a bunch of different enzymes that are working in the stomach, right? And once this happens, we've also got this other gateway over here, a sphincter that's usually closed until the digestion happens, and this we call the pyloric sphincter, because we're now leading into the pyloric cavity of the body. Okay, but this is essentially what happens in the stomach. Now, moving away from the stomach, we move into the small intestines. But just before I draw the intestines, there are two things that are important here. We've got a duct over here that comes from this organ that is attached to the liver, which I will just draw as this triangle here. Okay, so this guy over here is just the liver, which we also call the factory of the body. This guy does so much for us. It also produces the most amount of heat in the body, but the sheer amount of work that it does a crazy amount of things for us, and it also will be, you'll see it here lending a helping hand. You're going to see it in other places as well, lending a helping hand later, right? But again, just remember that we do call this the factory organ of the body, but the sheer amount of work that it does, right? It's like, I would almost say that it's kind of carrying the body on both of its shoulders at times, right? But anyways, what this liver does is the liver over here produces bile. Okay, this produces bile and it secretes the bile into this gallbladder over here. The gallbladder just stores the bile. It doesn't actually produce bile. It stores any excess bile, and then this bile will be released into the small intestines or into this tract over here. Okay, so this over here is the bile duct, which will actually be transferring bile into this pathway that's right after the stomach, okay, which will feed into the small intestine. Now, bile has only one function. It's kind of mechanical. It's not really chemical. Well, what this does is it actually emulsifies fats. Okay. Now, emulsification is just the process of increasing the surface area, basically, right? What happens is you have this large fat globule, and this fat globule is then broken down into simpler droplets, tinier droplets, right? That's not to say that they've been chemically broken down. This is a physical breakdown process. So all this bile is doing is it's not chemically breaking down the lipids. It is physically just splitting them up into smaller segments so that those smaller segments can be broken down more easily later on by enzymes. Okay, that's what this bile does. The other function of the bile is that it actually neutralizes the stomach acid because we don't want the acid going down and corroding the small intestine because only the mucus, like that mucus layer, is only present at the stomach to be able to neutralize the acid. It's not present anywhere else in the body, which is why when you get a heartburn, you would feel your throat being burnt up, right? So bile is really important in making sure that the acid is neutralized. One very fun fact about bile is that bile also has a different color from the rest of the body. So back then, people used to believe that disease was not caused by microorganisms, but they used to believe that disease was caused by the balance of fluids in the body. And bile was one of those fluids that they took into account because of its difference in color. They used to call it bile, which we still do to this day, but they called it bile because it emphasized the color of the fluid, I believe. Anyways, um, the other chemical as well that's secreted over here comes from another organ. This kind of leafy kind of structure. So I'll just draw like this. Okay, we call this the pancreatic duct, and this releases two other chemicals, which we call pancreatic amylase, and there's also pancreatic uh, protease as well. But I'm just going to talk about the amylase in this case. So we have pancreatic amylase, which does the same exact function as what we've defined up here for this amylase. It also breaks down amylose into maltose. So in case there's any of them that haven't been broken down here, those are going to be broken down here. Okay. Then we finally have this stomach lining here, or rather this intestine lining here, that will start to coil and coil and coil. Okay. Not just coil this way, but it makes it very long, complicated kind of pathway of looping and coiling inwards and so on. All that coiling is happening to increase the time taken for the food to travel so that digestion can actually take place fully. Okay. Now, all this comes under the small intestine. But the small intestine itself is divided into three categories. The first part here is called the duodenum. This is the part where the digestion is going to take place. Okay. And in this region, we have other enzymes from the small intestine. That is the lipase. You can also have pancreatic lipase as well. That helps here. You've also got peptidase, and you've also got maltase. Okay, these are the enzymes which is breaking down the food. Now, the lipase breaks down the lipids into fatty acids and glycerol. Peptidases, this will break down peptides, which are shorter chains of proteins, into what do you call it? Into these amino acids, which are the singular building blocks of the proteins. And then maltase, this breaks down maltose into glucose, which is a fundamental sugar that we need very desperately, right, for energy. Now, this duodenum is then later going to lead on to the middle stage of the small intestine, where more of the digestion happens. If I just draw it over here as lines, right? This over here is called the jejunum. So the jejunum. Okay, and then after the small intestine, we then have this highly coiled region, which I'll just draw like this, I suppose. Which you can call the ileum. Now, important feature about the ileum. The ileum's main job is to help with absorption of the food. Right? That's the main key point of what the ileum does. So the duodenum and the jejunum, that those main points, or those main functions, are for digestion, right? So they have cells that will secrete the chemical of enzymes to digest the actual food. But in the ileum, they have cells that are going to be absorbing the food instead. So one thing about the ileum is that, as you can see, the surface area is highly coiled. So that increases the surface area for diffusion and absorption to take place, right? But another nice feature about them is that if you look at the cells over here, okay, not only are they coiled, but each of these layers over here actually have these small finger-like projections like this, right? So you can see that these finger-like projections, we call these villi. Okay, if I had to draw one villi for you, it would look like this. And again, the function of the villi is to increase the surface area for absorption. And there's also blood vessels inside here, and these blood vessels are increasing the concentration gradient to make sure that the food is absorbed readily into the body. Okay, and the smart thing about these villi as well is that if you zoom in on the villi again, you see that the villi are made up of these cells that have small finger-like projections on them. So you've got a nucleus here, you've got mitochondria, and so on, right? Now, these finger-like projections, these are actually called cilia, but the main purpose of these finger-like projections, right, we call them microvilli. This again is to increase the surface area even more, right? So you can see how learning about diffusion in the previous lecture, right, essentially lets you know how it's going to become relevant here towards life as well, right? So biology is always constantly trying to fight against thermodynamics, trying to favor that process of the passive transfer of diffusion, so that we can absorb that sugar really easily into the body. The only issue becomes that if we have a lot of sugar inside the body, then we need to rely on active transport instead to take in that sugar. Okay, it becomes a bit more complicated, but we'll learn about that later on. So, anyways, that is what happens in the ileum, and then finally we have, once this ileum is done with absorbing all the food, or hopefully absorbing all the food, we will have this appendix over here, which we used to call a useless organ, but now we believe that maybe there's some use in how it stores the gut bacteria. That's what we believe right now, that maybe it's storing the gut bacteria. Inside the gut, I should just mention this while we're on the topic, inside the gut we have bacteria that don't belong to us. This is this bacteria that are actually friendly towards the body, and they actually help in digestion, right? And doctors believe that this bacteria is helpful in the digestion process, and if you ever damage the bacteria, that is actually what leads to an imbalance inside the gut, which is what leads to a possible kind of stomach upset and so on. Okay, but the appendix, some scientists believe right now, or there's some evidence to suggest that it helps in being a safe house for the gut bacteria. We then lead to this bigger part that is called the large intestine. The large intestine kind of goes all the way above these small intestines, coils up like this, and then runs back down until it then moves over here. Okay, so this part over here, just before the anus, which is right over here, we have the anal sphincter here, we'd have the anus basically this part here, right? This part here is called the rectum. Whereas this longer part over here is called the large intestine. Okay, so the function of the large intestine is twofold. The first part is really just to absorb water. The second part is just to store feces. Okay, these are like the two functions of the large intestine, right? So the large intestine will just contain the leftover food that's not been digested or absorbed, and that's stored in the rectum, and then later on it'll be released into the environment, right? So that rectum, or the feces that is released, is this undigested food, right? Which is why some animals, for example, actually end up taking in their feces multiple times. Rabbits is a really good example of this. What they do is after they actually let out their feces, I believe they just um, take them in again. And the point is they want to make sure that the food is fully digested. So that's like an evolutionary thing for rabbits to be doing. For humans, there's no benefit from doing that, so we've evolved to just see feces as disgusting, which is, well, I would say it's a good thing, because there's not really much benefit to doing that anymore, right? Uh, but either way, another number you should just keep in mind is, typically speaking, when you are harvesting organisms from, let's say, sheep or cattle or plants, typically speaking, the amount of food that we get from them as a whole, like the amount of calories we get from them as a whole, tends to be 10%, right? What that means is that if I was made up of 100 joules of energy, let's say, and a tiger ate me, then that tiger would receive only 10 joules overall in that process, right? There's always like a very small amount of the actual energy that's taken into the next like level, that's taken into the next level organism, because a lot of their energy is actually lost to the environment or it's not fully digested and so on. Okay, um, but this is the entire human digestive system in a nutshell for you. Of course, there's a bit more nuances here and there, but this is as good of an outline that you ought to know, right? So again, we start with the mouth, and in the mouth we've got the chemical breakdown and the mechanical breakdown. Moving on from the mouth towards the stomach, where we have the slight mechanical turning of the food to produce chyme, which will then flow into, after it's being digested by the enzymes, it'll be flowing into this um, tract over here. In this tract, we have the liver and the pancreas both helping by secreting chemicals into it. And then this chyme will flow deeper down into the duodenum, where digestion is allowed to take place for a longer amount of time, then the jejunum, and then the ileum, where absorption is taking place through the maximally through the villi, the longer coiling pathway of it, and the microvilli. And then from the villi, it then flows into the large intestine, where you have this appendix over here that acts as a safe house for bacteria. And from that, we have this big, large intestine here, which is storing the undigested food as well as absorbing any water, which is why usually when you don't drink enough water, then that will lead to constipation because it's harder for the lining to move the food around. Okay. With that said, there's another topic that I want to talk about this really quickly, which is the concept of roughage. Okay. So you might think that the food that we eat that is not digested is not important, but it is kind of important in the sense that roughage forms something that's called dietary fiber. Okay. Fiber refers to the part of the food that's undigested. Okay. Now, if you eat something like a plant has, if you remember the plant cells, right? Plant cells have cell walls. The cell walls in those plant cells are actually made up of cellulose. And cellulose actually has a type of glucose that we cannot digest entirely. Okay, so we can't actually digest cellulose in its entirety. So that actually makes up the fiber of food that we cannot fully digest. Now, animals also have some amount of fiber, but it's really not as much, okay? So if you want fiber, you need to be eating leafy substances like lentils and all those kinds of things, okay? But the function of the fiber is that it's purposefully undigested so that the body has something to push against, okay? So this gives the body something to push against. So it gives the lining of the gut something to push against, because if not, then everything is just going to be like a liquid. Okay, and this pushing action takes place in something that's called peristalsis. You can see peristalsis not just in how our gut moves, but also in how earthworms move. So if you know how caterpillars or earthworms move, that they kind of contract their muscles to move along, that is what peristalsis is. It basically happens in our gut, which also theoretically means that you could actually eat in the absence of gravity. So if you eat in the absence of gravity, it's not like our food's going down because of gravity. Of course, it would be more stressful, but you could theoretically still eat upside down. It would just be more stressful on the body, right? But the reason why you can do that is because of peristalsis. Now, peristalsis is the alternating compression and relaxation of the muscles to be able to move food, right? It kind of looks like this. You can imagine the track like this. It squeezes over here and then relaxes and then squeezes over here, right? So we have a big ball of food over here, which we call the bolus, by the way. Okay, but you can see that this kind of like wrap over here is kind of squeezing the food along the tract. Okay, that's what happens in peristalsis, which is why if the food is very difficult to push against, then that's when you feel pains, for example, right? So another point about this as well is the stools that emanate from the anus. If those stools are ever runny or soft, then it usually indicates there's some kind of issue, right? So usually the stools have to be hard, like they not too hard, I suppose, but they need to make sure that they, or you need to ensure that they have texture. If like a common way to check if you've got any symptoms of like bad digestion that's going on, or if there's something deeper going on, like maybe there's something cancerous, for example, is to check the stools. If the stools have any kind of runniness to it, then that is indication of some kind of infection, like diarrhea or something like that, right? Or stomach upset or dysentery, right? So that again relates to what we're seeing over here with peristalsis. So typically, the food that is in the that's carried throughout this tract needs to be semi-solid, right? So if it's solid, then it's not going to be able to move that easily. If it's liquid, then it's going to be too runny to move. So semi-solid is that kind of Goldilocks region of how the food needs to be for the body to actually move it just fine, right? Now, another point as well is I just want to come back to this point of enzymes here, okay? What you should understand is that amylase only acts on amylose. It doesn't act on anything else. In the same way, peptidase, right, um, which comes up in the pancreas. So I'll just write this over here because I've forgotten to mention it. So that also comes up as peptidase, right? Peptidase is what breaks down from the pancreas proteins into peptides as well. Okay. Now, what you need to understand about all of these enzymes like lipase and maltase and so on is that they are all specific on what they act. Okay. What that means is maltase only acts on maltose. It doesn't act on anything else, right? It only acts on maltose. Okay. So there is a theory as to how these enzymes act that you should know about, which is called the lock and key model of enzyme action. It essentially looks something like this. Okay, let's say that we have um, a peptide here. So this would be a dipeptide. And let's say that over here we have the enzyme, which in this case I guess would be the peptidase. What happens is this peptide is going to float around randomly, and it's then going to, well, actually, let me just draw the orientation correctly, like that. Okay. So what this enzyme is going to do is this enzyme is going to float around randomly because of the varying temperature. The peptide is also going to float around randomly. Just by chance, what's going to happen is that this guy is going to fit into this area, this region over here, which we call the active site, which is where the enzyme is actually letting the reaction occur. So once it fits in, it's going to look something like this, right? So you have the enzyme that, or the chemical that's fitting right here, right? So this we can also call the substrate, by the way. Once it fits into the enzyme, we get something that's called an enzyme substrate complex. It's a complex because it's made up of multiple molecules. Okay? Once this complex is made, the enzyme will actually weaken this bond over here. This chemical bond is weakened. And once the chemical bond is weakened, then the substrate is released, broken down, and now this released as products. Right? So you can see the products being produced from this enzyme here. And the enzyme is left unscathed from that entire reaction, right? So here is just a typical example of a lock and key model where the enzyme is participating in the reaction, but it doesn't actually get used up, right? So that enzyme over there is now ready to rinse and repeat with another dipeptide that we might eat later on, right? So that's essentially happening with all of the enzymes in the body. Okay, just one more keyword that I want to mention before we move on, and that is just with the enzymes over here, you should also know about one more enzyme, which is just carbohydrates. So all of those amylases and maltases that I talked about, they all come under the category of a carbohydrate, right? So a protease acts on protein. That's the enzyme that acts on protein. A lipase acts on lipids. Carbohydrases acts on carbohydrates. Okay, so that is what these enzymes, like what the category comes under, right? Notice this small point as well. Carbohydrates are made up of the elements carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen on the periodic table. Protein are made up of carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen. Sometimes they could have sulfur, and sometimes they could have phosphorus in them. Okay, they can also sometimes have some trace metals in them, like iron and magnesium and so on. Lipids are made up of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. just like carbohydrates, but they tend to have lower amounts of oxygen usually. Okay, now in the time that we have, there's one more example that I want to run through before we move on to the next topic. So for the next lecture, we'll probably just go through the cardiac system because this time we looked at the digestive system. But I want to just give you a bit of an outline first on the cardiac system, right? So remember, the entire function of the digestive system, as an example for you to see, is just how we actually digest food in the body, right? And how we absorb that food later on. Now, as part of the cardiac system, the cardiac system is the part of the body that actually delivers blood throughout the body. It actually regulates that blood flow. And what I want to do is I want to just explain to you what blood actually is. Now, blood is called a fluid connective tissue. Okay, connective in the sense that it connects different tissues in the body together, like how our bones and fibers connect different tissues together. But blood is a fluid in that regard, right? So we call it a fluid connective tissue. So blood is made up of a bunch of different components. The liquid component of blood is called the plasma. This is a yellowish kind of substance when it dries up, and this is called the plasma. It's the liquid component of the blood. Below the plasma, we then have WBCs. These are white blood cells. The scientific name for them are lymphocytes. They can also be called leukocytes. It's like pick your poison, right? Cyte just means cell in biology. Lympho means to do with the lymph system, which is to do with the immune system. The lymph system is basically the immune system. That's another organ system. It's a bit complicated for us to talk about right now, but we'll get into that like later on. Okay. And then leuko just means white, so leukocytes are white blood cells, right? So these guys have the job of protecting the body towards any kind of pathogen, which are disease-causing agents, right? So typically speaking, the white blood cell count in the blood is pretty small. But once you get infected, and if the body notices from any of the white blood cell counts that are roaming the blood, if they notice that you are infected, that there's a foreign organism, then the immune system will flare up and it will start to release more white blood cells into the blood. So a very easy way for a doctor to tell if a person is infected or not is to just take a sample of their blood and to count the number of white blood cells. If the number of white blood cells is above the average count, then it means that the person is most likely infected, or the person is responding to something that they deem as a infection, as a threat, right? It could just be that it's not actually a threat and the immune system is just having a false positive reaction to something, right? That could be an allergy, for example. Now, apart from the WBCs, we also have the major component, which is RBCs. RBCs are the red blood cells. These are also called erythrocytes. Okay, and then finally we have what is rarely called YBCs, which are yellow blood cells, but these are not actually yellow blood cells. The correct name is a thrombocyte, which is also called a platelet. Okay, now erythrocytes over here, these have the function of carrying oxygen. Okay, they carry oxygen and carbon dioxide through a protein that they have in them, which is actually called hemoglobin. We talked about this briefly when we were first talking about cells, like animal cells and plant cells in biology, right? But red blood cells kind of look like this. They have a biconcave disc-like structure. So this is supposed to be a dimple. Imagine that it's a dimple. So if I was drawing a view for you, and in the cross section here, if I cut this in half, it would look like this, right? The reason why is because there used to be a nucleus, and that nucleus is now removed. And instead of having a nucleus in them, the nucleus is replaced with this hemoglobin protein, which carries the oxygen and the carbon dioxide in the body, right? And this red blood cell has no mitochondria because we don't want it using up the oxygen. We want it to be carrying the oxygen to different parts of the body. Okay? The white blood cells, these again are just used in defense against pathogen. The plasma, this dissolves many things like the glucose, the amino acid, salts, hormones, and so on. Okay, and the thrombocytes, the platelets, these get involved in blood clotting. So does the plasma, by the way. The way that blood clotting works is very fascinating. Basically, if you imagine you have a vessel here, okay, And if you have a cut in that vessel, let's say the cut's right here, okay, what basically happens is upon exposure to the oxygen or to the air, okay, the chemicals in this region over here notice that there is an exposure. The first thing that happens is the platelets move over, and these platelets over here release a cascade of chemicals. One by one by one, these chemicals are going to start to mesh together within the plasma and form this very fine net. This fine net is going to catch the erythrocytes, the red blood cells. So the red blood cells are actually caught in the net. And when the red blood cells are caught in the net, they actually start to dry up in exposure to this air. They start to crumple up, dry up, and then they form this very tough layer, which is that scab. Okay? So getting a scab from getting a cut is a good thing because the scab shows that the body is actually responding as required to actually seal that cut. Once that scab forms on the top surface, the wound underneath will slowly close itself together and will heal over time. Hopefully, if the wound's not severe enough, it might leave some scar tissue behind, but that will actually cause that blood clotting process to happen and to prevent further infection from happening. Okay, but that's basically what happens from the blood over here. The last thing that I'll just mention is that the blood is typically carried in blood vessels. Okay, and blood vessels can come in three types. We have arteries, we then have veins, we have capillaries. The arteries diverge into arterioles, which then diverge into capillaries, which then converge back into venules, which then converge back into veins. Okay, an artery is a blood vessel that looks something like this. It's got very thick walls but a very small hole to carry the blood in. Okay, uh, arterioles are the same thing but they diverge out more. Capillaries are smaller and they are just one cell thick. Okay, so again, arterioles have thick walls. We call this endothelial walls. They have collagen in them, which is like an elastic material that allows them to like stretch out a bit from the blood, right? And then this over here is just a very narrow lumen. Veins, they have larger lumens. Okay, so they have thin walls and larger lumens. They also have valves in them, right? So there are valves in them that prevent the backflow of blood. So we call these pocket valves. And what these do is that they prevent the backflow of blood. Okay, so typically speaking, right, veins are superficial and arteries are not superficial, they tend to be lower down, okay? There are some exceptions to this. For example, the carotid artery is actually located in quite a precarious location, right? So if you get a cut at the carotid artery, arteries typically have high pressure in them, like high blood pressure in them. So if you ever get a cut at an artery, then the blood is going to leak out very quickly because of the high pressure involved. But veins have lower pressure in them. So typically speaking, getting a cut at a vein is not as bad as getting a cut at an artery. Getting a cut at an artery is very bad, but getting cut at a vein is not as bad. It's still going to lead to blood loss, right? Because it's going to be quite a bit of blood. But if you could choose, you would much rather get a cut at a vein rather than you would get a cut at an artery because veins tend to have lower blood pressure, so not as much blood is going to leak out through them than in arteries, right? Capillaries, these are the parts where the artery starts to diverge and diverge and diverge, and then they become so small that they go into these capillaries over here. So just to show you like an example, you've got the arteries which will break down into the arterioles, which will break down even more into these many fine capillaries, right? And then these capillaries will converge into the venules, which will then converge into veins. Okay, that's kind of what it looks like. This part over here, the cells are so small that they can actually exchange their resources with the organs and the tissue fluid that's surrounding those organs, right? So the reason why they're so small is to allow efficient exchange of diffusion to take place, right? So they've got very thin cells to ensure that diffusion takes place very quickly, right? And that increases the surface area to volume ratio. So it's the same spiel of what you've heard before with diffusion, right? Now, as for how the blood actually flows in the first place, that we will cover on in the next lecture, okay? But just keep in mind that all of these arteries, veins, and capillaries contain blood, which is made up of these many different components. Blood itself has many different functions, so it carries different things across the body. And don't forget that another thing that it carries across the body as well is temperature, right? So not only does the blood actually carry water and protein and so on, it also carries temperature across the body, right? So, for example, the liver produces most of the heat from the body. So what the blood does is the blood carries that heat from the liver towards other parts of the body that needs that heat, right? So that's what's happening there. Okay, and the blood vessels tend to be a bit dynamic in the sense of blood vessels can shrink up and shrivel a little bit if the body needs to conserve heat, right? And they can instead expand if the body needs to radiate out heat. But we will learn more about this in later topics. Okay, but otherwise, this essentially covers this essentially covers what like the basic premise of organization in biology, right? You can see this happening in many organisms as well. The only other organism we're going to look at is plants later on. But again, in the next lecture, we'll look at the cardiac system. And then after we look at the cardiac system, we're going to look at into a bit about plants. After we look at plants, then we're going to look at a bit more about hopefully the endocrine system and the reproductive system and so on, right? So these are the different systems in the body that will help you like understand what the human body is about, right? And remember that this doesn't just happen in humans. What you're studying here can also be the basic background behind what happens in some animals as well, right? So it's important to apply your knowledge of what you're learning here into like other contexts as well. Yeah, I hope you enjoyed this then. If you did enjoy it, then do let me know in the comments. Do leave a rating. If there's anything else you want me to cover as well, just let me know. If you have any feedback as well to help me improve, do let me know in the comments. And if you did enjoy this, feel free to support me on Patreon. The link is in the description. Alright, thank you then, and I look forward to seeing you next time.